Bibles this morning to Daniel chapter 2. You might like to mark this passage. This is the chapter I'd like us to concentrate on this morning. And I've entitled the lesson here, "In the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom," based on Daniel 2 verse 44. Now you might remember that Daniel was a young man who was carried into Babylonian exile from Judah about 605 BC, and shortly after he was taken into captivity, the great king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, has a dream about this awesome statue. And we're going to have a look at that dream today. It was a dream that troubled him greatly, and he was upset by it, but Daniel helped him, with God's help of course, to understand what the dream was all about. And basically what the dream was all about was about a kingdom that God was going to set up in the future. So what I'd like us to do is to read through the passage this morning, and I've given us a few pointers along the way. Let's have a look at the first three verses where we find that the king has his dream. So Daniel 2 verses 1 to 3. "Now in the second year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar," now we think that Daniel went into captivity about 605 BC. So the second year of Nebuchadnezzar, very soon after that, 604, 603, who knows, somewhere around there. "Nebuchadnezzar had dreams, and his spirit was troubled, and his sleep left him. Then the king gave orders to call in the magicians, the conjurers, the sorcerers, and the Chaldeans to tell the king his dreams. So they came in and stood before the king. The king said to them, 'I had a dream, and my spirit is anxious to understand the dream.'" So let's go back to verse 1 here. Notice that Nebuchadnezzar had dreams and they troubled him. They troubled him greatly. And we know, as we go later on into the passage, down to verse 28, that this was no ordinary dream that he had. This was a dream that God had given him. And that's why he was so troubled by it. And I think before we go any further, we should ask the question, does God give us dreams like that today? Does God tell us things today in dreams like he told King Nebuchadnezzar back in the time of Daniel? And of course the answer to that is no. God doesn't speak to us by dreams today. And you might say to me, well, hang on for a minute, Al. You've got that wrong, because didn't Peter say in Acts chapter 2 verse 17 that in the last days your young men will see visions and your old men will dream dreams? Well, yes, Peter did say that. And that did happen in the last days. The young men saw visions and the old men dreamed dreams. But let's not forget the rest of the New Testament, where in John 16 verse 13, Jesus told his apostles that they would be guided into all the truth. All the truth. There'd be no extra needed. And they were guided into that all the truth by means of visions and dreams and other ways. But we're also told in the book of Jude, Jude 3, that the faith was once for all time delivered. So the apostles by various means were guided into all the truth, and that truth was delivered to us once for the whole time. So we have that truth now in our New Testaments. God doesn't need to communicate to us by dreams and visions anymore. He's already given the dreams and the visions of the last days to his apostles, who were guided into all the truth and have written that truth down for us. So as we look at this dream of Nebuchadnezzar's, we shouldn't be thinking that God's going to give us the same kind of dreams today. No, God will speak to us through his word today. But in these days, he gave this dream to Nebuchadnezzar, and Daniel was there at that time. Notice in verses 2 to 3, when the king had this troubling dream, what did he do about it? He called in the magicians, the conjurers, the sorcerers, and the Chaldeans. And unfortunately for the king, these people were charlatans. They were pretenders. They had no power. They couldn't do what the king wanted them to do and help him with his dream. In fact, later on in the passage down in verse 27, Daniel acknowledges that neither wise men nor conjurers nor diviners nor anyone are able to do what the king wanted to do, have them help him with his dream. These were fraudulent characters, you see. They were pretenders. They pretended they had power and were able to help people, but they couldn't do a single thing. They couldn't tell the king what his dream was. They couldn't tell the interpretation. They had no power at all. And that reminds me of the book of Zechariah. Zechariah chapter 10 verse 2. We're told there that the diviners see lying visions. They tell false dreams. They comfort in vain. They're all pretenders, you see. They have no real power. And in this chapter, we see again just how powerless they are. So the king has this dream and he's troubled by it. So let's go to the next little section, verses 4 to 12. He wants people to tell him the dream so that they can tell him the interpretation. Let's read from Daniel 2 verse 4. Then the Chaldeans spoke to the king in Aramaic, "O king, live forever. Tell the dream to your servants and we'll declare the interpretation." The king replied to the Chaldeans, "The command from me is firm. If you do not make known to me the dream and its interpretation, you will be torn limb from limb and your houses made a rubbish heap. But if you declare the dream and its interpretation, you will receive from me gifts and a reward and great honour. Therefore declare to me the dream and its interpretation." They answered a second time and said, "Let the king tell the dream to his servants and we will declare the interpretation." Well, that's an easy way out, isn't it? You tell us what you dreamt about and we'll make up anything we like and tell you that's what it means. And the king's he's no fool here, is he? He says, "No, I don't want that. I want you to tell me what I dreamed first of all, then tell me what it means, so I know that you're legitimate." Let's read on. Verse 8, the king replied, "I know for certain that you're bargaining for time, inasmuch as you have seen the command from me is firm, that if you do not make the dream known to me, there is only one decree for you. For you have agreed together to speak lying and corrupt words before me until the situation is changed. Therefore, tell me the dream, that I may know that you can declare to me its interpretation." The Chaldeans answered the king and said, "There's not a man on earth who could declare the matter for the king, inasmuch as no great king or ruler has ever asked anything like this of any magician, conjurer or Chaldean. Moreover, the thing which the king demands is difficult, and there is no one else who could declare it to the king except God's, whose dwelling place is not with mortal flesh." Verse 12, because of this, the king became indignant and very furious and gave orders to destroy all the wise men of Babylon. Wow, what a situation to get yourself into. Let's go back and have a look at verse 4. What did the Chaldeans request of the king? Well, we saw there, they said, "Tell us the dream." They wanted the easy way out. You tell us a dream and we'll tell you anything that we think that the dream might mean. And of course, they ask him a second time, down in verse 7, to do the same thing. "Tell us the dream and we'll tell you the interpretation." But notice in verse 5 that the king's command was firm. If they didn't tell him the dream, what the dream was to start with, and its interpretation, they would be torn limb from limb and their houses will be wrecked. But if they did, then they would be rewarded greatly. And as we go on in the passage, of course, Daniel is able to do this with God's help, and he is rewarded greatly by Nebuchadnezzar. Notice down in verses 8 and 9, how did the king respond to the second request by these fraudsters? Well, he knew that they were bargaining for time, we're told there in verse 8. And he repeats that if you do not make known the dream, you're going to be in trouble. And he knows that they were waiting in verse 9 for the situation to be changed, but it wouldn't change. He wanted to know what the dream was. He wanted them to tell him what he dreamt, then to tell him the interpretation. Now look at verse 9 in particular there. Why was the king so adamant? Well, if you look at the end of verse 9, he says, "Tell me the dream that I may know that you can declare its interpretation." You can see why Nebuchadnezzar was no fool in his day. You can see why he rose to such a high position, king of the empire of the whole world at that time. He was no fool. And he knew that these fraudsters could come up with any interpretation if he told them the dream. So he didn't want that. He wanted them to tell him what he dreamt first of all, so that he knew that they would have the power to interpret the dream. And of course, these fraudsters had no chance. Who can do things like that, as they protest in a moment? You see, the king was looking for proof that their interpretation was legitimate. not something they just made up and just to please him. And so if we go down to verses 10 and 11, notice how the conjurers and the diviners reply. They basically reply, we're completely powerless to do what you ask. They say there's not a man on earth who can do this. It's a difficult thing. There's no one else who could declare it except the gods, and so on. And I don't know about you, but in my Bible, I'd like to highlight those two verses, because these two verses, verses 9 and 10, show us the lasting condemnation against these occult practices. These people who claim to be mediums and spiritists and soothsayers and future readers and palm readers and tea leaf, whoever it is, don't these two verses condemn them forever? They've got no power. And these people here admit it. And let's not forget who we're talking about here. We're talking about the conjurers, the wise men, the diviners of the great world empire Babylon. These were no amateurs. These were the professionals. These were the top dogs. You couldn't get any higher than these ones. And yet what were they saying? We can't do it. We're powerless. We can't do what you ask. And it's a pity today, isn't it, that so many people are being sucked in by these fraudsters, these soothsayers, these diviners, these magicians of today, who like taking money. They'll take the money readily, but they offer nothing in return. They're powerless, just like these professional conjurers and so on were powerless to help in the time of David. And so you can see the king's response in verse 12. He was pretty upset about this. In fact, he was indignant and very furious, and he was going to kill all the wise men of Babylon. So let's go on to the next section then, verses 13 to 16, where because Daniel and his friends were classed among the wise people, they were due to be executed as well, but Daniel asks for time. Let's read from verse 13. So the decree went forth that the wise men should be slain, and they looked for Daniel and his friends to kill them. Then Daniel replied with discretion and discernment to Arioch, the captain of the king's bodyguard, who had gone forth to slay the wise men of Babylon. He said to Arioch, the king's commander, "For what reason is the decree from the king so urgent?" Then Arioch informed Daniel about the matter. So Daniel went in and requested of the king that he would give him time in order that he might declare the interpretation to the king. So again, if we just go back and notice a couple of things in that reading, back in verse 13, the decree went forth that the wise men should be slain. And notice Daniel, he being one of the wise men, of course, he approaches Arioch, the captain of the king's bodyguard, and notice how he speaks to him. It says there in verse 14, he replied with discretion and discernment. Now what does that tell us about Daniel? It doesn't seem like he's panicking. He's remaining calm. Even when his life's in danger, he remains calm, he doesn't panic, and he goes and speaks with the captain of the guard with discretion and with discernment. And that reminds me of Psalm 46, verses 1 and 2, that lovely psalm we sometimes sing out of the book, where it says, God is our refuge and our strength, a very present help in time of trouble. Therefore we will not fear. Though the earth should change and though the mountains slip into the heart of the sea, we will not fear. And you can see this in Daniel, can't you? Calamitous things were taking place, and yet Daniel wasn't panicked, he wasn't fearing. He went to the king and asked for more time to sort the matter out. Down in verse 16, he asks for more time. And we shouldn't think here that Daniel was an absolute nobody who could just wander into the great king of the world empire at will. I've jumped over chapter 1 this morning, but if you go back to chapter 1 verse 17, remember that Daniel and his friends were chosen because in Daniel 1 verse 17, these four youths, God had given them knowledge and intelligence in every branch of literature and wisdom, and Daniel even understood all kinds of visions and dreams. So God was with these men and helping these men, and Daniel says to the king, give me more time and we'll sort the matter out. Later on in chapter 1, down in verse 20, we find that the king finds these four men, notice what it says there, 10 times better than all the magicians and conjurers in his realm. Well, the magicians and the conjurers were useless. They couldn't do anything. So, of course, the others would be 10 times better than them. Well, let's keep going in the story. Let's go down to verses 17 to 23, where the vision is revealed by God to Daniel. So let's read from Daniel 2, verses 17 to 23. Then Daniel went to his house and informed his friends Hananiah and Mishael and Azariah about the matter, so that they might request compassion from the God of heaven concerning this mystery, so that Daniel and his friends would not be destroyed with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. Then the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a night vision. Then Daniel blessed the God of heaven. Daniel said, "Let the name of God be blessed forever and ever, for wisdom and power belong to him. It is he who changes the times and the epochs. He removes kings and establishes kings. He gives wisdom to wise men and knowledge to men of understanding. It is he who reveals profound and hidden things. He knows what is in the darkness, and the light dwells with him. To you, O God of my fathers, I give thanks and praise, for you have given me wisdom and power. Even now you have made known to me what we requested of you, for you have made known to us the king's matter." So Daniel, back in verse 17, goes and informs his three friends about the dire situation that they're in. And if you go to verse 18, he did this so that they might request from God help. And isn't that a lovely picture? Something for us to learn from today. In James 2:13, we're told if anyone is suffering, then he must pray. It shows us the importance of prayer, doesn't it? That whatever situation we're in, we should be praying without ceasing, taking the matter before God. And that's what Daniel and his friends do here. And notice in verse 19, God replies. He reveals the mystery to Daniel in a night vision. And in verse 19, we find that Daniel blesses God, or praises God if you've got the New International Version. And he goes on to say in verse 20 that God has all wisdom and all power. And I think what's interesting about these characters, Daniel and his three friends, was that even if God didn't reveal a dream to them, they would still be praising and blessing God. That comes across from the rest of the book, doesn't it? Daniel chapter 3, when the three friends were going to be thrown into the fire unless they fell down and worshipped the idol, they refused to do it. They would be thrown into the fire. They were resolute that they were going to serve God. Daniel chapter 6, Daniel was told not to pray to God anymore. He continued to pray and was thrown into the lions den. You see, these men were resolute in following God. And Daniel praises God here because God has answered him. But even if God hadn't answered him, Daniel would still be praising God with his three friends. And we need to remember that as well. But let's keep going down here. Let's notice as well that not only does he bless and praise, but down in verse 21, he says that God is the one who changes the times and the epochs. In the New Living Translation, that's translated as he controls the course of world events. God is the all-powerful one, you see. And notice in verse 22, God is the one who can reveal profound and hidden things. He revealed what the king had dreamed about to Daniel. And so Daniel, in verse 23, gives thanks and praises God because God had made known the dream that Nebuchadnezzar had had. And so let's go down to the next little section then, verses 24 to 30, where Daniel has to say to the king that the power's not in me. I'm not the one who's going to tell you about your dream. God's given me the mystery. So let's read that little section. Verse 24. Therefore Daniel went into Arioch, whom the king had appointed to destroy all the wise men of Babylon. He went and spoke to him as follows: "Do not destroy the wise men of Babylon. Take me into the king's presence, and I will declare the interpretation to the king." Then Arioch hurriedly brought Daniel into the king's presence and spoke to him as follows: "I have found a man among the exiles from Judah who can make the interpretation known to the king." Now that's interesting, isn't it? Daniel went to Arioch, but Arioch goes in and says, "Look, I've done it. I've found someone." He must have thought he'd found the goose that laid the golden egg, and he was going to get some kind of promotion or reward out of this. Who knows? But he says, "I found him," when it was Daniel who came to Arioch instead and said, "Look, take me to the king." But anyway, verse 26. The king said to Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar — remember that was the name they gave him in Babylon — Are you able to make known the dream which I have seen and its interpretation? He didn't just say, are you able to tell me the interpretation? He said, are you able to tell me the dream I had first and then tell me the interpretation? Verse 27, Daniel answered before the king and said, as for the mystery about which the king has inquired, neither wise men, conjurers, magicians, nor diviners are able to declare it to the king. However, there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries, and he has made known to the king Nebuchadnezzar what will take place in the latter days. This was your dream and the visions in your mind while on your bed. As for you, O king, while on your bed, your thoughts turned to what would take place in the future. And he who reveals mysteries has made known to you what will take place. But as for me, this mystery has not been revealed to me for any wisdom residing in me more than any other living man, but for the purpose of making the interpretation known to the king, that you may understand the thoughts of your mind. A very humble man, isn't he, Daniel? Didn't take credit for this, but gave the credit where it should have been given to God, who revealed the mystery. But notice, if we go back to verse 24, Daniel says, don't destroy the wise men of Babylon. Not only himself, of course, but all the other wise men. Don't destroy them. I'll be able to tell the king what the interpretation is. And down in verse 25, we noticed Arioch couldn't believe his good fortune. He raced off. I did it. I found this man. Verse 26, the king says, are you able to do it, Daniel? Remember, there's two things you've got to do, Daniel, the king's saying. You've not only got to tell me the interpretation, but you've got to tell me what the dream was first of all. Are you able to do it, Daniel? And notice Daniel's answer, verse 27, wise men can't do this kind of thing. Verses 28 and 29, but God can. And God's revealed it to me. And then that lovely verse 30, it's not in me to do these things. A humble man acknowledging that God has given him the answer. And notice here, in verses 28 and 29, we get a hint already about what the dream's about. It's about the future, what will take place in the latter days. So that's what the king basically dreamed about. So now that we've had a look at the introduction, let's get down to the crunch now. Let's have a look at what this dream was. And so the next little section then, from verses 31 to 35, Nebuchadnezzar dreamed of this great statue. So let's read that little section. Daniel 2, 31 to 35. Now remember, the king didn't tell Daniel this. God revealed it to him. Verse 31. You, O king, were looking, and behold, there was a single great statue. That statue was large and of extraordinary splendour. It was standing in front of you, and its appearance was awesome. The head of that statue was made of fine gold, its breast and its arms of silver, its belly and its thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, and its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. You continued looking until a stone was cut out without hands, and it struck the statue on its feet of iron and clay and crushed them. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver and the gold were all crushed at the same time and became like chaff from the summer threshing floors. And the wind carried them away so that not a trace of them was found. But the stone that struck the statue became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. Wow, well there's that dream. And if I put up an artist's impression of what that dream was about, again, this is only an artist's impression, but if you look again at verse 31, we're told that the statue was a great statue the king dreamed about. It was large, it was of extraordinary splendour, it was standing right in front of him in the dream, and its appearance was very awesome. Now, when I look at the artist's impression, he's done a much better job than I could ever do of drawing this thing, but that's not particularly awesome to me. Looking at that statue, but remember, it's only an artist's impression. The dream that Nebuchadnezzar had, it troubled him. It must have been frightening to see this large and splendid and extraordinary statue in front of him. But that's what his dream was all about. And what's interesting about the book of Daniel is that Daniel talks about what it represents in some other chapters, 7, 8 and so on, which we'll come to in a moment. But before we do that, there's a couple of things I'd like you to notice before we move on. Notice what the statue was made of in verses 32 and 33. And this is important. It was made of gold, silver, bronze, iron, and feet of iron and partly of clay. Now, what impression do you get here? It starts off with the gold and the silver and ends up with the iron and the clay. Well, it seems to start from great splendour and ends up in less splendour, doesn't it? But by the same token, it seems to start off with metals which are weaker before it ends up with the hard metal, the iron. So it's a statue that's an amazing statue in a way, with all of these different elements in it. And unfortunately on my diagram I haven't got verses 34 and 34 shown, where there's a rock that comes and smashes this statue to pieces. But if you have a look again at verses 34 and 35, we're told about this stone. It was cut out without hands. It struck the statue on its feet and crushed all at the same time. And then the stone itself becomes a great mountain and fills the whole earth. So sadly I haven't got that on the diagram. I couldn't find a diagram actually that I could use that had that stone smashing the statue, but you'll have to try and picture that in your mind there. But what I would like you to notice here in verse 35, notice the elements that are listed here in verse 35. Have a good look at it. The iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver and the gold were all crushed. The toes weren't left. You know, some false teachers say, well, this statue was smashed, but it's ridiculous, but I'll mention it. The toes were left, and these toes are going to grow longer into 10 nations. They're going to rise in Europe sometime in our future. What? Can you believe that? And yet when you look at verse 35, what does it say? The iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver and the gold were all crushed when? At the same time. There's going to be no gap or discontinuity in this. The whole lot gets smashed at the same time. You need to read this because false teachers are rife in our community and in many denominations teaching that these kinds of things haven't completely happened, that the statue's been smashed, but the toes are going to develop into 10 nations in Europe sometime with the Antichrist. I mean, it's just ridiculous. Daniel's given us a simple picture that we can all understand. The false teachers are complicating it to fit with their view, wrong view of the book of Revelation. So notice that. We'll come back to that in a moment. These 5 elements are all smashed at the same time and disappear. And down in verse 35, the stone itself becomes a great mountain and fills the whole earth. So, try and picture yourself now. There you are, you're Nebuchadnezzar. Daniel's come in and he's told you exactly what you dreamed about. And he's told you that it relates to the future and what's going to happen in the future. Well, now, if you're Nebuchadnezzar, you've got to say to yourself, well, this man knows what he's talking about. He's proven to me that he's got the credentials to tell me what all this is about. So let's do that now. Let's go on to the next little section and have a look at what the dream's all about. That's what the dream was, but now let's have a look at the explanation. So let's go down to verses, don't know what that is there. Oh, I think the person who's used the mat has left some grass clippings and so on here. So I've picked up a few grass clippings and whatever else there on the overhead, so we won't worry about that. But now, let's go to the interpretation. So let's go down to verses 36 to 45. This was the dream. Now we will tell its interpretation before the king. You, O king, are the King of kings, to whom the God of heaven has given the kingdom, the power, the strength and the glory. And wherever the sons of men dwell, or the beasts of the field, or the birds of the sky, he has given them into your hand, and he has caused you to rule over all of them. You are the head of gold. And after you there will arise another kingdom inferior to you, then another third kingdom of bronze, which will rule over all the earth. Then there will be a fourth kingdom as strong as iron, inasmuch as iron crushes and shatters all things, so like iron that breaks in pieces, it will crush and break all these to pieces. Verse 41, in that you saw the feet and toes, partly of potter's clay and partly of iron, it will be a divided kingdom, but will have in it the toughness of iron, inasmuch as you saw the iron mixed with the common clay. As the toes of the feet were partly of iron and partly of pottery, so some of the kingdom will be strong and part of it will be brittle. And in that you saw the iron mixed with the common clay, they will combine with one another in the seed of men, but they will not adhere to one another, even as iron does not combine with pottery. Now, verse 44, we get to the crunch. We get to the point of all of this today. Verse 44, in the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which will never be destroyed. That kingdom will not be left for another people. It will crush and put an end to all these kingdoms, but it will itself endure forever. Inasmuch as you saw that a stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, and that it crushed the iron, the bronze, the clay, and the silver, and the gold, the great God has made known to the king what will take place in the future, so that the dream is true and its interpretation is trustworthy. All right, there's the explanation. Let's go back over it for a moment. Let's go back to verse 36. Daniel went on to tell the interpretation. And remember back in verse 9, the king wanted the dream so that the dream explained so that he knew the interpretation would be correct. Well, Daniel's done that. He's told him what the dream was. Now he's telling him the explanation. And notice, if I put this back up again, he says to the king, you are the head of gold. You are the head of gold. And over in chapter 2, verse 48, we know that Nebuchadnezzar was king of Babylon. The Babylonian kingdom represented the head of gold through Nebuchadnezzar. Chapter 7, it's referred to as a lion. But can you see in this dream that Nebuchadnezzar had, it's like a vertical timeline. Nebuchadnezzar was being shown the existing world kingdom, followed by the next 4 world kingdoms. The next 3 would be destroyed, but the 5th one, the last world kingdom, would be a world kingdom that would never be destroyed and would be set up and would remain forever. And so this statue, as I said, is like a vertical timeline from the time of Nebuchadnezzar, about 600 BC, down to the Medo-Persian Empire, which is the chest of and arms of silver. You can see that from chapter 8, verse 20 of Daniel, where he mentions the Medo-Persian kingdom. The 3rd kingdom, the thighs of bronze, which are the leopard in chapter 7 and the goat in chapter 8. Daniel explains in chapter 8, verse 21 is the Greek Empire. And then the last one, the terrifying and frightening beast, well, Daniel doesn't tell us who that is. He tells us about the Babylonians, the Medo-Persians and the Greeks, but he doesn't mention the name Rome. But you don't have to be a Rhodes Scholar, do you, to work out the sequence here? If we've got Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, it's not a great jump to work out the next one, is it? Rome. Rome was the next world kingdom. And although Daniel didn't mention Rome specifically, the New Testament specifically mentions Rome as the next world kingdom. For example, where are we here? John 11, verse 48. Remember, the Jews said, if we let Jesus go on like this, all men will believe in him and the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation. So we know that the Romans were the 4th world empire, even though they're not named specifically by Daniel. But notice here as we go on in the story, what would happen in the days of those kings? Daniel 2 verse 44. What would happen in the days of those kings? One empire would be replaced by the next. So when we get to the last one, in the days of those kings that have taken in all the others before them, what would happen in the days of those kings? Well, now we come to the crunch of the whole dream. God's kingdom will be set up and it will never be destroyed. And so when was God's kingdom set up? Well, it had to be set up in the time of the Roman kingdom. These false teachers that I mentioned earlier, the premillennialists, represented by someone like John MacArthur in the supposed MacArthur Study Bible. Now, this study Bible is based on the King James Version, New King James Version. Nothing wrong with the New King James Version, but MacArthur's notes, which are added in here, are absolute rubbish. False teaching. And I spent, how much was it? $40. Well, that was a waste of $40 buying that. Because MacArthur says in here, and I quote from page, when I can find it, page 1230 of that study notes, he says this: the iron toes represent the Roman Empire in its revived form before the second coming. What? Did you hear that? He says that because we all know the Roman Empire is long gone, he says for this prophecy to be fulfilled, according to his false teaching, then the Roman Empire's got to come again before Jesus' second coming. This is because they've misunderstood the book of Revelation. They're premillennialists. They believe that when Jesus came the first time, the Jews rejected him and thwarted his plan to set up the kingdom. So he had to postpone it until he comes to... I mean, it's just... How can people believe it? And yet so many people do believe it. And yet Daniel's picture is a rather simple one, isn't it? In the days of the fourth king, the kingdom will be set up. I'll remind you of a few scriptures from the New Testament on this. Mark 1 verses 14 and 15. When Jesus came along preaching the gospel, can you remember what he said in Mark 1 verse 15? The time is fulfilled and the kingdom of God is at hand. Jesus said, look, the time's up. The time's up. These kingdoms have come and gone. It's the Roman kingdom. The time's fulfilled. The kingdom of God is at hand. It's near. It's going to be set up just as Daniel prophesied. Mark chapter 9 verse 1, Jesus said to his disciples, truly I say to you, there are some who are standing here who shall not taste of death until you see the kingdom of God after it has come with power. So he said that some of his disciples in their lifetime would see the kingdom come with power. Colossians 1 verse 13, we might turn to that one. Colossians 1 verse 13, most scholars believe that the letter to the Colossians was written about AD 60. And notice what's said here in Colossians 1 verse 13. We're told here that he, God, rescued us, past tense, Christians that Paul was writing to in 60 AD, and Paul himself had been rescued from the domain of darkness and transferred, past tense, to the kingdom of his beloved Son. 60 AD, people were in the kingdom along with Paul. And yet John MacArthur and other false teachers are saying, no, the Jews rejected Jesus. The kingdom didn't come. The kingdom won't come until Jesus' second coming. This statue's got really long toes. They're 2,000 years long so far, and they're going to be a bit longer still. I mean, who can believe that rubbish? Listen to what the scriptures teach. Don't listen to the false teachers. The picture that's painted for us in this dream is very clear and easy for us to understand. That kingdom was set up in the first century in the days of those kings. It exists now because it won't ever be destroyed. And people might say, well, where is that kingdom? I can't see it. Well, remember what Jesus said in John 18 verse 36. My kingdom is not of this world. My kingdom is not of this... It's a spiritual kingdom. People who believe in him and who are baptised and who follow him are a part of that kingdom right throughout the world. That kingdom which will never be destroyed. The gates of Hades will not prevail against the church. That's the point of what we're looking at this morning. That's what the dream was all about. There's no suggestion of any discontinuity or any gaps in this statue. And Jesus did do exactly what the prophecy says. In the first century, he built the kingdom. He built his church as in fulfilment of that prophecy. Let's go back to verse 35. Remember, the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, the gold were all crushed at the same time. That's everything on the statue, including the clay, including the feet and the toes. The whole lot was smashed at the same time so that the kingdom could be set up. Let's not be fooled by false teachers. Down in verse 44, notice who would set this kingdom up? God. God can't be thwarted. The Jews couldn't put God off his purpose. Job 42 verse 2 says that God cannot be thwarted, and we shouldn't believe the false teachers that tell us that the Jews could thwart Jesus in his day. Notice it'll crush and put an end to all of these kingdoms, and it will now become the eternal kingdom. And it's the last world kingdom, of course, because it's forever. There won't be any others after it because it's the kingdom that is forever. And notice verse 45, the great God has made known to the king what will take place in the future. And you might say to yourself, well, if I was Nebuchadnezzar sitting there, how could I know that this would be true, that it would come to pass? Nebuchadnezzar wouldn't live to see these things happen. How could he know? Well, the point was, of course, that Daniel had already described the dream to him. Nebuchadnezzar didn't tell Daniel what he dreamed about. Daniel had to tell Nebuchadnezzar that this was the dream before he interpreted it. So even though Nebuchadnezzar would not live to see these coming kingdoms, he would know that they would take place because Daniel had shown him the power that he had to interpret the king, to tell the king his dream before he interpreted the king's dream to him. And so that's why in our last little section this morning, let's have a look at how it all finishes up in verses 46 to 49. The king promotes Daniel and so on. Let's read on. Daniel 2 verse 46. Then King Nebuchadnezzar fell on his face and did homage to Daniel and gave orders to present to him an offering and fragrant incense. The king answered Daniel and said, "Surely your God is a God of gods and a Lord of kings and a revealer of mysteries, since you have been able to reveal this mystery." Then the king promoted Daniel and gave him many great gifts and made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon and chief prefect over all the wise men of Babylon. I bet those wise men were pretty happy to have him as their chief. He just saved all their lives, so I don't go to argue with this. Verse 49, and Daniel made request to the king, and he appointed Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego. Now these were the names that his three friends were given in Babylon, so it's the same three friends we read about earlier. Daniel requested that they be put over the administration of the province of Babylon while Daniel was at the king's court. So notice back in verse 46, the king falls down and pays homage to Daniel. Now we shouldn't think that Daniel's accepting worship as a god. As we know in the next verse, the king is praising the God of heaven who revealed these things to Daniel. But the king falls down in homage here. He plainly understood that God was the one who had done this through Daniel. And as true to his word, he promotes Daniel, gives him great gifts, makes him ruler and chief prefect. And then Daniel has a request for his friends that they be promoted as well. What a chapter. I know we've taken a bit long this morning and I'm a bit sorry for that, but you can't really break that up into parts and do one part this week and another part the next week. But what a chapter. Recognise that the diviners and the conjurers are useless, powerless. See how important it is to pray to God in times of suffering. Notice the great wisdom and the knowledge and the foreknowledge of God in all of this chapter. And understand, most importantly, of course, God's kingdom has been set up. That's been the point of the lesson this morning. The title of the lesson has been that in the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom. That kingdom has been set up. Don't believe the false teachers who say we've got to wait till the second coming for a revived Roman Empire. What baloney. They only say that because their theory doesn't fit the scriptures. There's going to be no revived Roman Empire. The Roman Empire is long gone. The kingdom has been set up. And when Jesus comes the second time, it won't be to set up a kingdom. It'll be to split humanity into those who go into eternal life and those who go into eternal punishment. Remember that the kingdom exists from that first century, now, and up until the time of Jesus' second coming. And the passage I'd like us to finish with this morning is in the book of Acts. Let's go to Acts chapter 8. Because we should be a part of this wonderful spiritual kingdom in which there is salvation, forgiveness of sins and redemption, as we've already read in Colossians 1 verse 13. But not only should we be a part of that kingdom, we should be telling this good news to everyone else, that this spiritual kingdom is here now and you can have forgiveness of sins and redemption. Notice Acts 8 verse 12. Philip, we're told here that they believed Philip preaching what? The good news about the kingdom of God and the name of Jesus. Philip went around saying, look, the kingdom's here. If you believe in Jesus, you can be forgiven of your sins, you can be redeemed, you can be added to that spiritual kingdom. That's great news. And Philip was telling people about it. And notice the reaction. They were being baptised, men and women alike. Be baptised to become a part of that kingdom after believing in Jesus. He who believes and is baptised will be saved, Mark 16 verse 16. And then go around telling people the good news about that spiritual kingdom which is now in existence, in which you can have forgiveness of sins and redemption. What a dream. What a dream Nebuchadnezzar had. And what a marvellous fulfilment that God was showing Nebuchadnezzar that he was the fifth last world kingdom that there would ever be. And there would be a fourth and a third and a second last kingdom, world kingdom, until the last world kingdom came, which began in the first century and will continue until Jesus' second coming. That's what Nebuchadnezzar dreamed about. In the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which will never be destroyed. Let's think on these things now as Carl leads us in the last song.